Timothy Clement-Jones, Lord Clement-Jones. Very warm welcome to Digital Markets Research Hub. You are one of the most experienced and one of the most impactful politicians, policymakers in British politics, and one of the areas of your expertise and policy making is actually regulation of digital markets, digital economy, and digital society more broader. Because our format is interesting for students and some policymakers and practitioners beyond the UK, maybe we can start this conversation, which will be focused mainly on digital markets and digital economy, with maybe if I can ask you very briefly to explain or to trace the development of your political views and the views on regulating technologies.
Yes, well, thank you, Alice. I've had a very hybrid career because I'm a lawyer and a politician, and I've been very lucky in being able to do them in parallel. Because when I was working as a lawyer in industry, and I worked in a lawyer in industry for 25 years, and then I went into a private law firm after that. I've been able to do that in parallel with politics, and I've always had a very strong interest in policy, but I only really became interested in the digital side of things because of the impact on the creative industries. So that in the early 2000s, I saw things like Napster beginning to take effect. And I thought, well, this is really interesting. Is this the way that the rest of our economy is going to take shape, basically? Of course, the internet started up in the mid-90s, and that had an impact on us economically and so on. But I think it was really in the early 2000s that I think we all began to realize just how much was moving digitally. And then I thought that with the development of artificial intelligence in, say, sort of 2015-16, which is when we were beginning, I think DeepMind were beginning to have their discoveries. We were coming out of what was regarded as an AI winter because of the increasing compute power that gave us the ability to crunch much bigger data sets than before. That the development of artificial intelligence was something that a lot of people didn't understand, particularly in Parliament. So I then set up an all-party group of parliamentarians really to inform ourselves and to develop a community of people interested in AI. And really that's continued. I was then asked to chair an inquiry through a select committee on artificial intelligence back in 2017. And as you know, it's been a roller coaster ride since then. In the last 6 years, every single year has brought more focus on artificial intelligence, sometimes not helpful, but it certainly brought more focus and more debate about the future of artificial intelligence. And so in a sense, although you could argue that there are other digital aspects, blockchain, Internet of Things, so many other aspects of the digital world, I think the current focus really rightly is on artificial intelligence. And so that's what I spend most of my time talking about, the implications of and commenting on policy being made worldwide, basically.
And obviously, I had some questions on artificial intelligence related matters, but I wanted also to ask you about Digital Markets Competition and Consumers Bill and some other legislative initiatives, as well as how we plan to envisage the future format of the relationship between Competition and Markets Authority with Parliament and government. But as we already at AI aspect of our conversation, I wanted to ask your view. What is, if you trace the evolution of this concept itself, as well as how different jurisdictions, different countries, let's say, respond to this new opportunity and new challenge, can we see that some countries are more successful than the others? And would it be because the technology is so borderless, it's so global in a sense, isn't it this, are we witnessing, confronting a conundrum where it is essentially a race to the bottom, where the weakest link in the chain with the most opportunistic interventionist, or let's say most opportunistic way to do hands-off approach essentially, and encourage all the ethical compromises which one can even imagine, will eventually train their algorithms to the best level, becoming policy maker and agenda setter essentially in the global run. What is your view on this matter?
Yes, I don't agree with this worry about the race to the bottom, because I think that every government has an interest in making sure that AI is our servant and not our master. I mean, you've seen that the Chinese government has adopted the Beijing principles. They've adopted rules for generative AI for their private sector. The US has issued, from the White House, has issued an executive order. Their National Institute for Standards and Technology is also very heavily involved in setting risk assessment standards. The EU likewise. In fact, and ironically, the UK is the outlier, and I don't believe that that is ultimately a long-term thing. I think that simply they seem to believe that they're going to get an advantage in the short term if they don't regulate too heavily. But I don't think that they're going to be able to avoid regulating in the future, because exactly as you say, you're going to need an international approach to this. And my view is that even though people may be reluctant to actually legislate or regulate, that we're going to be adopting common international standards. So things like risk assessment, impact assessment, monitoring, audit, testing, and so on. And there will be a convergence. There has to be a convergence, because otherwise we'll find that our developers, our big corporates, even our medium-sized corporates that want to adopt AI or develop AI, will find that they have multiple standards to adhere to in different jurisdictions. And that, because of the nature of the digital world, which is highly linked and needs to be interoperable, if you don't have common international standards, you're going to have real problems. So I actually believe that this is going to be relatively straightforward in the future. We just need to get people to understand what the agenda is. I mean, where I think it's slightly unhelpful is for people to focus entirely on the future of artificial general intelligence, for instance, and none of us know if or when that's going to arrive. What we need to do is focus on current risks presented by biased data, misinformation, the impact on jobs and the need for upskilling, those kinds of risks, which we know are already there. And, I discussed with many people through our report 6 years ago. So, this is not new. We need just to get cracking and set that level playing field.
And when we talk about competition in digital markets, we somehow intuitively understand who are the key stakeholders who, mainly the companies which will be negatively affected by the new rules. When we talk about AI, it's getting a little bit less clear for people who, because it's so compartmentalized, you cannot monitor the details and nuances in all sectors of digital society. Can you maybe very briefly explain what is the main counter argument? What's the main opposition? Is the opposition united somehow to your ideas, to your vision of the need to have a kind of quasi-global solution, or at least a regulatory framework for future regulation of AI?
Yes, interestingly enough, I don't think the opposition is to competition policy in this area. I think everybody, pretty much, whatever their political views about whether or not regulation is pro-innovation or not, and I have a a strong view that regulation can be very pro-innovation, but irrespective of that, most people think that competition legislation in digital markets needs to be very proactive, basically, because what you have to do is legislate or regulate ex ante. You've got to anticipate what happens because of Metcalfe's law, because of the network effect and so on, in digital markets being so powerful. And we've already seen that. I mean, you know, the fact that Amazon is just about the only major digital retailer. How many app stores are there? You know, and the same, if we're not careful, is going to happen in the world of AI as it is. Who do we talk about currently? We talk about OpenAI, Anthropic AI, Google, Microsoft is effectively an investor in OpenAI, and then you've got Meta, which has Llama. But beyond that, who else is there who's got a powerful AI, generative AI system, large language model? The reason there's so few is because they need huge amounts of exacompute, of computing power, huge data sets, very sophisticated semiconductors, and of course, they've got very expensive skill sets among their workforce. And all those are scarce commodities, all very expensive commodities. So what we have to do, if we're going to have innovation and we're going to have people able to enter new digital markets, particularly in things like AI, we have to make sure that we have a competitive playing field. And that means regulation in the competition area, in my view, and I think in the view of most people. So and I think digital markets are uniquely capable of consolidation and monopoly. And I think we've become all aware of that over the past few years.
And before moving to the bill, the DMCC bill, the last question on AI, again, in comparison to the relationship DMA and DMCC, we see that different gatekeepers or different undertakings with strategic market status, or using UK vocabulary of the bill, have different priorities maybe, and they would be less comfortable with some aspects of the bill and more comfortable with other aspects of the bill, and they somehow consider strategically to use some aspects of the DMA and DMCC, maybe trying to enter into each other's markets, because you've said only handful are capable to compete meaningfully with each other, and it's a systemically entrenched area. Do you see that the strategic interest in the area of AI, of all of this handful of the most advanced companies, are united, or they are divided and they somehow try to endorse one specific vision of AI regulation which would favor their vision, their interests, as opposed to alternative one which would be in the interest of their main competitors? So it's kind of a horizontal battle rather than attempt to protect the market from the newcomers, because there is only very few who could use all this computational power, which is barely available for many.
Yes, funny enough, I don't think they have a view yet. I think a lot of the developers of these big large language models aren't really looking at the competition aspect currently. I think people like the platforms are, the social media platforms and the app stores are. But I think that, in a sense, AI is just an example of what could come down the track at this moment. I think at the moment it is fairly competitive. It's just that as we go forward, the need for these big data sets and exacompute are going to be so important that if we're not careful, we're going to focus down on 2 or 3 of these large language models. I want to keep it open and competitive. But I think there are issues, you know, for instance, in search. I mean, who else outside Google and Bing are there? Nobody really. DuckDuckGo barely gets a look in, you know, all this kind of thing. So I think what we're using is the experience of the past to try and work out what to do for the future. And, you know, I'm in favor of our digital markets legislation, which is now before the House of Commons. It's going to come to the House of Lords soon, but there are still some flaws in it which need sorting out. And, you know, obviously that the role of the House of Lords is to kick the tires very heavily on legislation to make sure it's fit for purpose.
Let us now then revert to the bill itself. We know that UK was the leader in terms of proposing the very idea, the very format, and tailoring the main parameters of the new regime. And obviously then we try to use the second mover advantage, looking at the DMA and trying to learn from some potential pitfalls and mistakes of the enforcement of the new regime. And we already see some elements which are much more pro-enforcement in the DMCC. For example, the much more flexible format of designating undertaking with strategic market status. We already witnessed how litigious the gatekeepers in EU are trying to challenge the most obvious aspect, the very start of the game, which would be completely in the hands of legislators to minimize such conduct. Quite predictable if you look at retrospectively, so to say. How do you evaluate the bill as it we now have the latest version issued by the government, or some amendments have been already manifested, or obviously just a very recent development, but do you see that there are some systemic pitfalls which you in the House of Lords would be able at least to address and scrutinize in detail?
Yes, there are a couple of systemic problems still, but the big worry at the moment is the watering down potentially of the bill in terms of a change from allowing companies issued with orders from the Competition and Markets Authority, where the DMU will sit, the new Digital Markets Unit will sit. They will be able to, if the government makes the changes that it's promised to make, or said it's going to make, they're going to be able to challenge decisions on the merits test as opposed to judicial review, and the merits is like it's you know, going right back to square one, and obviously companies affected by decisions from the CMA are going to use that route, you know, and this could be a real problem. Whereas judicial review, the test is really whether any reasonable authority could have made that decision. And so by and large, it's pretty straightforward at the end of the day. I also think that the current bill has some issues surrounding it. The whole concept of countervailing benefit is potentially a problem, because if a company can simply show that, oh, well, fine, there isn't a lot of competition, but the consumer is getting a huge amount of benefit out of this, then in a sense that negates the whole issue of market entry and so on and so forth, and the benefits per se of competition. It's saying the consumer benefit outweighs everything that you think about the need for competition and innovation in a marketplace. Well, that is not right in my view. So how you define countervailing benefits is very important. And the other aspect, which is really completely the opposite end of where the government appears to be going at the moment, is how quickly can the CMA act in terms of imposing orders on companies that it's regulating. I would like to see its ability to get injunctions, so in the interim period it can enforce its will, obviously only for a short period. It can be challenged on that, but it does mean that if it sees actions being taken which need quick action, then it can do the necessary. But again, that's an aspect that we will be debating very heavily when the bill comes to the House of Lords.
My problem is countervailing benefits exemption. I have several issues. The first one, the most foundational, and the one which can turn the game completely, is the mandatory nature, at least in chapter 3. Turning it into optional would give the CMA the necessary discretion to bargain within this framework of regulatory dialogue, and have the ability either to accept them, consider it internally, or say we have discretion not to accept without providing solid, robust economic evidence, which is next to impossible to do, or referring to consumer. And if you have to demonstrate the benefits of consumer, it's so easy, or business users. The current version talks about even potential users, which makes it very easy. Obviously, CMA says that the standard of indispensability will somehow make the job difficult, but in the best case scenario, it will delay, referring to the timeliness of this regime, and rechannel the limited creative energy of the CMA DMU to the issues which have been already settled or addressed, or somehow triggered the whole reform within the ex-post competition law, which necessitated the DMCC at the very beginning. But moving to the issue of a regulatory dialogue, where assuming the CMA will have an ability to sit and talk with designated undertakings, showing to them their discretionary power bestowed by the parliament on one hand, and mandating them to act in a specific way, either in fine-tuning specific obligation or conduct requirements, or maybe looking a little bit wider in the long-term perspective. I imagine that this new change, this necessitates a revision of the role of CMA in the broader governmental agenda or constellation, let's say. And the previous ethos of CMA as being neutral, independent from any policy making, apart from releasing once a year a report, was very elegant if we look at law and economics as the main toolkit for measuring the success, because any policy making could affect the correctness of economic calculus. But because this concept is so much discredited, at least in ex-ante regulation, we acknowledge that discretion is inevitable. This has to be revised, and CMA at least must be mindful of broader societal interest as shaped and perceived by parliament and government. Do you have this in your plans to at least to restart the discussion, reconceptualize the whole issue, or is it something which is so established and so matured in the framework, in the architecture of UK policymaking, that it would be next to impossible?
Well, I mean, I'm going to argue that actually the CMA is already a very activist body. And of course, Jason Furman, with his report some years back in 2016-17, I mean, was recommending that it simply got greater expertise and powers in the digital space. And of course, that's exactly what it has been preparing for. And the CMA, as you've seen, I mean, they've, they overlap in some cases. They're so keen to talk about things. They've got a study on generative AI currently. Well, you could argue that, other regulators like the ICO might have an interest in that. But the CMA is the one that decided to do the study, but I've got no objection to that. I think the important thing is to have active regulators, and the CMA is a very active regulator, and I'm very pleased that it has been doing what it's been doing. It's been challenging some of the big platforms and so on, but it should be independent of government. What we object to in my party is when the Secretary of State is able to give directions to a regulator, and increasingly this appears to be the case. And it's quite interesting because the Select Committee on Industry and Regulators is doing a study on the regulatory system we have in the UK, and they're looking at precisely that sort of area as to how independent our current regulators are, whether their duties are clear enough, whether they've got the resources to do what they should do, whether they've got the skills to carry out the job that they are tasked with. So some very interesting work there being carried out by that committee, which I think would be worth looking at, because it does go to the whole philosophy in a way that you're talking about. But for my money, an active regulator, but independent of government, but with very clear duties, is very important. And a competition authority like the CMA should be there to promote competition and growth for the benefit of the UK economy.
Okay, let us pause on this normative aspect. What should it be? What should it be doing? Would you be able to provide at least some elements of your kind of vision about the goals of the new regime? What should we be? Obviously we are talking about simultaneously pursuing different goals, which are maybe partially mutually irreconcilable even. But I imagine the main would be one of the few would be most ambitious and the least realistic, would be helping our jurisdiction, our nation to and their companies to mature and scale up to the level which would be more or less comparable to the current hyperscaler. This is illusionary. We understand that it's very difficult to do, but would be it's one of the goals. Others are less ambitious and more realistic, focusing on competition downstream, bringing some order, some transparency and accountability with how frivolous and unaccountable the many of designated companies behave in digital markets, which they have created essentially, and thus feel almost proprietary entitlement to do whatever they want. And there are other more hybrid objectives of the new regime. What is your vision about the priorities? What should we aim to achieve with this new rules?
Well, you've talked about behavior, and I think getting the right behavior in the marketplace is really important, quite frankly. And of course, we all have different views about what the right behavior is, but what we don't want is behavior that locks out competition, basically. I mean, for instance, behaviors when you're being procured by government, for instance, that means you're locked, the government or a big purchaser is locked into your product. So all those kind of lock-in behaviors need to be dealt with, and they're partly because they're partly consumer related, even if they're B2B. But they're also competition related. So I think, you're trying to ride two horses at the same time, but that's no bad thing, because sometimes you need to ride those two horses. What's good for the purchaser is good for competition. Now, that's not always the case. And sometimes you have to choose one or the other. But I think you have to have some vision about the at least the possibility of markets not being difficult to enter. Now, of course, as I've said, even in the AI world, the new AI world, it is very difficult to enter unless you've got the resource, and so I'm with you on being realistic about this, but I think you've just got to push it as hard as you can. So that, in a sense, abusive behavior is prevented. What you can't do, you're not a government department that provides resource for people to compete with. You just have to clear away the barriers to competition and prevent anti-competitive behavior, and also make sure that there is no as little consumer detriment as possible. But again, it's all relative. So it does require a considerable amount of judgment on the part of the regulator, and this is where principles of transparency, proportionality, and so on come into play. And we have quite strong principles that we apply to our regulators, and this is why I think it's unhelpful once government has set the rules and set the duties of a regulator. That's why it's very unhelpful for government to keep intervening in the role of the regulator and direct them to do this, that, or the other. That, to me, means that you get uncertainty out there for business, for consumers, and so on, which I think is deeply unhelpful.
in your lawyer capacity incarnation, so this question is to this part of your professional DNA. We recently hear comments of mature, established lawyers who work at Competition Appeal Tribunal, for example, that they understand the difference between JR and full merits review, and they acknowledge the concerns that full merits review will delay and complicate the most simple elements or the most formalistic elements of the procedure. But because the stakes are so high and the designated undertakings are so keen to challenge either designation or specific conduct requirement, they will still try to master their professional legal and economic skills, and will be using even JR standard to achieve maybe not the same but quite comparable delays or even victories. We know that that some cases have been lost by not only CMA but also the Commission on purely procedural ground. Do you think that this JR and full merits approaches, which are being considered, will be considered now in the House of Lords inter alia, they would really be a meaningful, they would create, we are talking about two completely or significantly different trajectories of the functioning of the new system, because the CMA is insisting that having full merits review will just limit their will refocus their limited resources on discussing completely different issues, much less strategically important. People in Competition Appeal Tribunal say that this will be anyway complicated because stakes are high, and even JR standard allows for all these procedural casuistical discussions. How do you see this problem?
Well, look, I'm not a specialist competition lawyer, but I do believe that there is a big difference between the merits test and JR. So I mean, I would keep it as it is, but what I'm in favor of is interim solutions. So basically, the CMA can impose a solution pending legal JR review, and that seems to me to be the right way round, because it means that JR review will take place quite quickly, that you won't extend the process too much, and it means that it doesn't drag out forever. And of course, you know, we're dealing with very large businesses potentially who have deep pockets and a lot of resource to fight the CMA's decisions. But I still believe, you know, what do you do otherwise? Do you just say, well, the regulator has the absolute power to regulate? That can't be right. You've got to have natural justice. On the other hand, you can't drag it out forever, where the only people who win are those who can afford to pay for the most expensive lawyers. So I think we've got the right balance. And let's face it, we've learned some lessons. I mean, Ofcom, before they changed some of the tests to JR, had to fight legal cases, you know, almost incessantly. And I think it was the right thing to do to change that legislation as well, where Ofcom quite often has been, you know, dragged through the courts on a long-term basis. So I think we've reached a point where we know what is effective, and I very much hope that we'll all resist the quite heavy lobbying from big tech that's taking place at the moment.
I must note, following all these oral discussions which take place, which have been taking place in the House of Lords in Communication and Digital Select Committee, it was really impressive to see the level of understanding by the Lords and the mechanics and all the strategic techniques. You can immediately conclude that it's not the first legislative process you participate in, and you somehow sense most of the problems, and then you using your expert witnesses and clerks, you are able to fine-tune the system. So are you optimistic about the bill itself? Are you confident?
No, I'm not. I mean, you're absolutely right about the Communications and Digital Committee, and the chair of that, Baroness Stoll, who is a conservative backbencher, has been very clear on behalf of her committee, saying that the bill mustn't be watered down. But you know, there's still time to change it, and it's not very clear what the impact of the current government regulation amendments that they've put forward for report stage in the House of Commons are, quite honestly. You know, I've looked through them, and you know, it's not clear to me that they are actually putting back some sort of merits test. You know, if they are, it's quite well hidden in the amendments. But that's me. I mean, until it comes to the Lords, I haven't, you know, read every last clause and amendment. And no, obviously we'll have to do that when it comes to us.
My personal one of very few which you have submitted is Section 5 designation, which mandates the CMA to do five years forward-looking assessment. So my concern is that it's next to impossible. It's crystal ball gazing. And in order to prove the entrenched market status, looking ahead is a little bit inconsistent from purely linguistic point of view. So whether the very fact of designation could be challenged by showing how the CMA didn't manage to do the impossible challenge to offer the vision of what will happen in 5 years' time in order to demonstrate. It's a little bit illogical, but hopefully it's just a matter.
That's one of the areas that we could change. And you're right. I mean, and also the fact that it's fixed for that period of time. I mean, you know, we wouldn't have if it was all fixed from now, we wouldn't have included, say, anthropic AI in there. And yet, actually, those 4 or 5 key developers of large language models, you could say they've all got strategic market status now. You know, it isn't just ChatGPT, for heaven's sake. There are 4 or 5 large language models now, which effectively are strategic in their impact.
Yeah, indeed. And also in contravailing benefits exemption, there are 4 criteria, and the 4th one has been copy pasted, but the last few words have been omitted. So it requires to demonstrate the designated undertaking that the conduct, that the contravening benefits don't infringe effective competition. But it should be effective competition in the internal market, in the significant part of the internal market. So otherwise, the condition D makes little sense. If it doesn't harm effective competition, then it would not be it would not be a conduct requirement at first place. But this is my I have documented these comments, of course, and they are just you know, from purely observer point of view. I also wanted.
Well, I like your comments, Solis, and I shall be relying on you for amendments when it comes to the House of Lords. I mean, there are some very good points there.
Thank you very much. It's an honor for me, Timothy, even to hear this. I wanted to close. We traditionally have this, and I'm particularly keen to ask this question to you, given your expertise and your competence, your broader vision. What would be your sincere recommendation to those who just embark on this really amazing time, on this really amazing area of regulation and enforcement? Students, postgraduates, undergraduate students, what mistakes should they try to avoid? What competences should they get? What difficult choices they will be facing? Please give us this you know, pastoral recommendations and suggestions.
Well, I think one of the big issues we've got in society at the moment is digital exclusion and digital literacy. And I think that in a sense, we all just assume that young people are all about, you know, they're digital natives and so on. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think they've got to try and understand exactly what is happening to them. You know, it's the Shoshana Zuboff aspect of surveillance data and so on, which is so important. People need to know, you know, what they're doing with their own data, what impact the online world is having on them, you know, what these new tools can do for them, but also how dependent they might become on them. You know, I mean, Google Maps is a wonderful thing, but people don't read a map nowadays, but once, if you were plonked somewhere without access to online, how would you find your way around? You know, I mean, there are basic things like that. So I do think that there's a duty to really, you know, understand the digital world, but B, I do think it's really important also to be cross-disciplinary. I don't think it's good enough just to be a technologist or a lawyer nowadays. I think you've got to be a mixture of both. And I think that, you know, you've got to, if you're a lawyer, you've got to understand ethics nowadays, for instance. If you're a technologist, you've got to understand ethics. If you're a technologist, you've got to understand the creative world, because you know, you're using great quantities of intellectual property. If you're a creative, you need to understand technology, because the potential of technology is enormous. So my message is cross-disciplinarity is really going to be more and more valuable as time goes on. And that's what people should be cultivating.
Lord Clement-Jones, thank you very much for this really illuminating conversation. It was my utmost pleasure to hosting you in this conversation series. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you, Oles.